Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Juan Pablo Cappello, former CEO and co-founder over at Nue Life. And we talk today about his recent statements on LinkedIn about now not being able to categorically support at-home ketamine and some nuance here. And it was really a great conversation about, and at times triggering for me, and for those of you who listen to the show regularly, you'll understand this. But yeah, like we, as people interested in doctors doing good medical practice, we should really look at what's going on with ketamine and question, is it good medical practice? And I don't have a clear answer for you. I personally think there's ways in which we could do at-home ketamine well, but JP brings up some really great points here, and I think we should all ponder this stuff. So I hope you all enjoy this episode and, share it around. And this ketamine conversation really is just getting started, as is the rest of the psychedelic conversation. So plenty of room for us to keep developing. All right. Well, enjoy this episode with Juan Pablo Cappello, and we will see you on the other side. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. We are joined today by Juan Pablo Cappello. How are you today?
Great. Great to be back on. Always great to keep the conversation going.
Yeah. So you're a lot of things, but you've been on the show before a few times, I think. And then I was a big fan of your project, Nue Life, when you were steering that ship. It seemed like one of the handful of ketamine operators I could get behind.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, you got it. And we're here today to talk about at-home ketamine. You published a week or two ago an interesting piece saying, I can no longer support at-home ketamine. And it made a splash. So I'm like happy you wrote that.
It did. You did something right when you start getting medicine phone calls from people in the industry. So that's good. Got to stir things up a little bit.
Oh, that's lovely that you had that kind of reaction. I didn't realize people came at you. That's fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's to be expected. But look, we started Nue Life with the goal of trying to help 1 million people address the root cause of their depression and anxiety. So we had this big ambitious goal, and we didn't start the company to be a telehealth company or an at-home ketamine provider or a teletherapy company. Just, when you start thinking about how you're going to help people at scale, you start realizing, okay, ketamine, if you don't want to go to jail, as my uncle did for cannabis, ketamine's sort of the tool you need to use. Telehealth, telemedicine could be improved. But we were, for a reason, just about the highest cost at-home ketamine provider, because we weren't really an at-home ketamine provider. We were a mental health company that was leveraging ketamine and offering, coaching, teletherapy, all this integration and aftercare, which is expensive. And, that model worked very well, and we can talk about it until, there began to be changes and a lot of economic pressures in the market that made that model unsustainable. And, I'm very, very concerned about where the industry is today, just as I was when we started the company. And we almost started the company as an answer or as a reaction to where the industry was. And, unfortunately, I think the industry has progressed in some areas and is floundered in many others. So we can talk about all that.
Great. Let's for a minute, just like high level, give people background on you.
Sure.
What were you up to? I don't know, the decades leading up to psychedelics.
Yeah, so I grew up in Chile. I was exposed to the indigenous traditions quite young, and I brought a Native American church to South Florida about 12 years ago, and began skirmishing with the DEA. Thought religious freedom was very important. And I was very troubled that sort of the sacred family that I would sit mainly with Wachuma, that we were risking, going to jail. And yeah, very, very passionate about religious freedom. I happened to build the first online bank in Latin America. We had a big exit, sold that for The company was valued over $700 million. I like to joke when, that was a lot of money. The last venture cycle, that was sort of, a nice Series B or something, but, that was an unfathomable amount of money. And after we sold the company, I decided, my mom would point out that if you're keeping score, you're already losing. And I decided, from then on in, one, everything I made over a certain amount of money a year, I'd just give away as a way that I wouldn't be sort of keeping score anymore. And two, I would only build companies that, had a real social purpose behind them. So I built the first crowdfunding platform in Latin America, IdeaMe. We've helped tens of thousands of creatives raise the initial seed capital they need to realize their dreams, left that in the hands of one of the co-founders of Tom Shoes. And he continued to steward that company. And then, we started Nue Life with this ambitious goal of helping 1 million people address the root cause of their depression and anxiety. And that was coming out of COVID. And I got to say, I was just horrified with where the psychedelics, of the for-profit psychedelic companies, were headed. It seemed to me that the teams were very homogeneous, and so we started a team, the whole founding team, people of color and women. The focus was too much about money. I think we were probably the very first, sort of high-profile public benefits corp. So we were balancing mission and margin right from day one. There was a lot of people upset about some of the patent applications that had been filed by Compass and others. And so, we committed ourselves to open data. And so, we ultimately collected the clinical results of over 10,000 patients, 100,000 ketamine experiences, and, did everything we could to make that data public. So we just, we tried to build a very different kind of company. And, we met with a lot of success early on because we were so different and so differentiated than everyone else in the market. We weren't a ketamine first company ever. We were really a mental health company. And ketamine, an amazing tool, but only an amazing tool if it's followed or supported by integration and aftercare. Surprise, surprise. Just like every other psychedelic, right? I mean, it's not that surprising, but somehow it's a lot harder to do that than to just, push ketamine. And a lot of people in the industry, before we got involved, were pushing ketamine, and a lot of people in the industry continue to just push ketamine.
Right.
It's good business. It's a good, it's a nice reoccurring revenue model, but it's shitty for patients. So,
So, like we have to go a little beyond the psychiatric model too. Like the psychiatric model is a big deal. But there's more here than just psychiatric stuff, right? It's a much bigger conversation. Anyway, your article kind of said head on, like the economic pressures and incentives that we're seeing are leading towards some relatively bad behavior in the space. I think you said something like, we're kind of promising healing, but what we're actually really promising is, $200 to $600 a month, like recurring revenue, coming directly from people who aren't getting any kind of insurance reimbursement. And it's like, it can get expensive. And is it actually helping? And is it actually fitting that initial promise of like huge psychiatric win for a patient?
So look, I mean, whether, and again, I want to start off by saying there's all sorts of ethical, companies and practitioners who are doing the good work every day on the front lines. And we have to, recognize that. We also have to be honest that it's harder and harder for those ethical practitioners to make a living because of what unethical practitioners are doing every day in the trenches, which is slinging ketamine. And what do I mean by this? If you think about it, as I keep saying, ketamine requires integration and aftercare. So you do 3 to 6 sessions of ketamine once a week, medium dose to highest dose, and the results are really remarkable. You have, we found that 2/3 of our treatment-resistant patients, so the hardest patients to help, had a 50% reduction of symptoms So that means 2/3 of our patients, treatment-resistant patients, were no longer clinically depressed or anxious, you know, about a month out after that initial 3 to 6 treatments. What we also found is if those patients were not supported, those patients slowly over the next 2 weeks to 2 months came back to baseline. So what does that tell you? It tells you that ketamine is great to reset, but doesn't have long, sustainable results unless you're supporting those patients going forward. You know, integration and aftercare is very expensive. And what we saw as we talked to potential investors and as we looked at what other at-home ketamine providers were doing was they were essentially trying to get patients on what they call maintenance ketamine, which is, hey, we accept that 2 weeks to 2 months after you do your treatments, you're going to be back to where you were. So guess what? You're going to take this ketamine lozenge. We're going to charge you, as you point out, a couple $100 a month, and we're going to make it a subscription model. And think about it. Now, those ketamine operators no longer have to provide integration and aftercare because they're accepting 80-90% of their patients are going to revert back to baseline within a couple weeks or a couple months. And two, they're getting what's called reoccurring revenue. And guess what? Venture capitalist investors value reoccurring revenue at 3 to 5x more than non-reoccurring revenues. And so the business model really promotes these reoccurring revenues, putting patients on maintenance ketamine. We began, hearing reports that many at-home ketamine operators had as one of their KPIs, one of their key performance indicators, what percentage of patients were on their reoccurring revenue model. To give you an idea, at Nue Life, that number was just over 10%, which felt about right. So that meant that about 10% of our patients had gone through our initial program, had good results, and then needed to come back later, for a little more ketamine, because guess what? Life happens. They maybe, didn't do the integration and aftercare that was offered to them, and they needed a little bit more help. And that was fine. But think about it. If what you're doing is giving patients ketamine on a regular basis, it's like yo-yo dieting for people's emotional well-being. Imagine, somebody who's struggling with weight, if that's something, that's important to them. They lose 20 pounds, and then a couple of months later, they've gained it back. And so they, take a pill. Now they lose it again. Now they gain it back. Well, guess what? That's not good for your health, whether it's your physical health or your mental health. Mm-hmm. And so we at Nue Life built a whole suite of digital tools to support patients after they did the ketamine with the express goal that most of our patients, if not a huge majority, 80 to 90% of our patients, would never have to use ketamine again. But again, that's super expensive. It's not the kind of economic model that's favored by investors. You can certainly make it a very sustainable business model, but it's hard. And what my piece is just trying to point out is, let's have an honest conversation about where the incentives are. Let's recognize that the more providers that are writing scripts easily and putting patients on maintenance ketamine, the harder it is for the providers who want to do the good work of deep healing to find patients who understand that and are willing to pay them more upfront to actually get well, as opposed to, other prescribers and practitioners who are just, giving the promise that our pharmaceuticals do of take this pill and you're going to feel better. And again, do I think that it's probably a good trade to, take ketamine a couple times, 6 times a year, as opposed to taking an antidepressant every day? Yeah, that's probably a good trade. But there's a better trade, which is let's address the root cause of your depression, anxiety, or trauma once and for all. Let's do the hard work. Let's use ketamine as a beautiful tool to help you reset and reboot. And let's get you well. And let's support you in your wellness journey going forward, rather than putting you on the cycle of feeling better, feeling worse, feeling better, feeling worse.
Did you ever get exposed to any horror stories from that side?
Well, here's the thing. Again, what we built at Nue Life was extremely unique. We built digital tools that tracked. We created a new score, which not only tracked the experience of the patient during their ketamine journeys, but also every day, almost like a Fitbit, we had rings that was, physical health, mental health, and emotional health. And what was the patient doing on a given day to support each of those three, right? Just like a Fitbit measures your physical health. Well, imagine, and then okay, I'm getting enough steps in, but I'm also sleeping enough, and I'm also doing some meditation, or I'm doing yoga. So the patients could, get points essentially for different things that they would do, but then they would also self-report on a daily basis how they were feeling. Because guess what? Here's a very good example. We built a tool. Well, guess what? Just like people with gaining weight tend not to wake up one day and you've gained 20 pounds. It's happened slowly over, a number of weeks. Similarly, most people who are doing well, if suddenly we realize that they're exercising less, they're sleeping less, and they're on their phone more, well, guess what? You don't have to wait 3 weeks till that person's depressed. And then at that point, they come to you and you just offer them more ketamine. What would we do at Nue Life? We would see that the algorithm would essentially see that the person maybe was trending not in a direction they wanted to be trending. And before they got depressed, our clinicians could proactively, intervene. The algorithm could send, for instance, the patient in that example, a text saying, hey, if you do a private one-on-one coaching session this week, we'll give you 50% off because it seems like you might need it. Are you interested in that? If you are, click here and you can sign up right away. So, we had tools and we developed tools, and it cost us, by the way, our company raised $26 million, and we got up to $1 million a month of revenues in less than a year because we had extremely differentiated product. I mean, to give you an idea, when we talked with Andreessen Horowitz, they told us only 1 out of 10,000 companies they looked at had a growth curve the way we did. And even with all those digital tools, as the market got more saturated and as other companies, both inpatient clinics and at-home providers, began just focusing on offering ketamine with the lowest barrier to entry. And what they would say is, we're taking the friction out of getting ketamine. And I was like, how's that a goal? How's taking friction away from, prescribing ketamine a goal? I mean, it's good to have less friction, with your bank maybe, but definitely not with a tool as powerful as ketamine. And so what we found was that we got to $1 million a month of revenues in less than a year, which is an incredible growth story. But then as the market got more and more saturated, we began to see that upwards of 3/4 of our patients or prospective patients were just saying to us, well, how much is this a month? Oh, so-and-so, will get me a lot more ketamine, ask me a lot less questions, and ask a lot less of me. And so it became, it became harder and harder. I mean, we continued, for people who think like, oh, this guy's bitter because he just failed. I mean, we continued to have over $1 million a month of revenues. So, we were doing just fine, but, we're all affected by market forces. And, I'm willing to be honest that it became harder and harder given the market dynamics to maintain the standard of care that we were really comfortable in maintaining.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing, the ecosystem causing the issue, kind of tragedy of the commons style. So when I love that, and thanks for laying that out for us. So when I think about mail order at-home ketamine, there's a couple things that come to mind. There's serving the rural populations.
Yep.
because there's so many people that have really poor access to healthcare. Like you and I know Colorado to a degree here. Oof. And like the rural populations are hurting. And they don't have access to care. And people, like, let's be real. Even if you live in a city, your access to care isn't all that great often either. So,
well, if you make 50 grand a year, if you live on Main Street, I remember one of the most heartbreaking things that would happen. I mean, to give you all an idea, I come from a digital marketing background, and we were very good at, acquiring customers. That's called customer acquisition cost. And we screened, because we were so good, we could be, very selective. So only about 20% of prospective patients who we interviewed or who came through our digital funnel, ultimately, we would invite into our program, right? So again, super different approach. What VCs and investors want to see is, hey, what percentage of good leads are you able to convert? And, we would only convert about 20%, not because we could convert a lot more, but because we were super selective about who we took in, right? And so you ask about horror stories, 1,000, 10,000 patients, and EMS was only called once. And, that was just somebody had a panic attack and, misrepresented their medical history. And, we were tracking all of the patients. The reason I mentioned this is, going to what you said, the most heartbreaking thing is where I would get emails from, I remember a single mother in Georgia, rural area, saying, hey, I work 2 jobs. I've tried to commit suicide twice. Suicidal ideation's a no-go for us. And, I can't pay anything more than, I want to go with a provider like you. I realize therapy is what I need, but ketamine's going to help. I don't want to go to one of these, ketamine places that just, is dishing a lot of ketamine. Please help me, because I need your solution. And we would not take her as a patient. And it was heartbreaking for me, because I knew the standard of care she was going to get somewhere else. But again, I just sort of felt like, if we compromise our intake procedures just because we thought we could help somebody and it would probably be okay, all we needed was one negative outcome, and all of the good work we were doing for, hundreds and ultimately, 1,000 plus patients a month would go down the drain because of the one negative outcome. And so it's very hard. And, that's why I'm being very honest and vulnerable that, when you're on the front lines, and I put, my partner and I, we put millions of dollars of our own money into the company because we really believed in what we were doing. And I never drew a salary. And so it's very hard to, make these ethical decisions when, it's affecting your bottom line, your investors' bottom line. You have employees, you have all sorts of responsibilities. But so, yeah, going to what you said, we have to do better to have these low cost models, because, one other thing, with my mom, I remember when I told her that I wanted to focus on Nue Life, and she said, okay, what's the mission? I said, help 1 million people address the root cause of their depression and anxiety. And she said, well, what kind of million people? And, she was sort of like, just rich people, just 1 million rich people. And I was like, no, I want to be able to help first responders. I want to be able to help school teachers. I want to be able to help veterans. And she said, good, get to work.
I love that.
So, yeah.
So yeah, like access is a big deal. And, a lot of people just don't have access to stuff. And it's scary. It's sad. We see it all the time. So that's one of the reasons I was so bullish on the at-home ketamine model. I still hold hope. I think with technology and other things, we're going to come a long way in the next handful of years, honestly, with at home. But yeah, like your points are really well taken.
Look, I think at home there, I mean, we, as I said, we started the company because we didn't want to criticize the industry from the cheap seats, right? So I was mortified by what I saw in the psychedelic for-profit space 3-4 years ago. And so I said, okay, let's take, a bunch of money that we have and let's show that you can build a different kind of company that's mission focused and really prioritizes the standard of care and that can be successful economically. And we accomplished that. And the way we accomplished it was building tools that really supported the patient. So I described the Nue score. We, had tools that I mentioned, tracked the patient throughout their, ketamine experiences. We had Nue Care, which was a whole subscription service, digital based, where the goal was our patients never to need more ketamine. So again, the opposite of where the industry's moved, and you can do that. And at scale, if I decided if there had been money in the market, another $20 million, I would have gotten to scale. And, it would have been a beautiful revenue model because our reoccurring revenues would have been this subscription, not slinging ketamine, but offering integration, aftercare, and counseling for the long term. But that takes a lot of time to build up. And, the reality is, people are always looking for the fast, cheap solution. And that's, often in a lozenge. But yeah, look, I think, what I'm trying to do is I started the company to be at service of the industry and of patients. And, now that I'm not running a company anymore, what I want to do is, sort of be honest and encourage practitioners to be honest about the incentives that exist. And with those incentives, if we can just be honest, we can start thinking about how we avoid the worst of it.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I had to sit for a little while after reading your first one because I'm like, let's call us drug liberal. That I was like, oh, good. Like, this is yet another thing that potentially helps like strengthen drug war thinking.
Right.
But then I had to think about it from the perspective of, you're coming at it from a clinical lens with like, FDA regulation and medicine as a whole, like as we're dealing with it today. And I'm kind of like encountering it from a drug liberalization perspective where people might have safe supply and might not, be putting very inappropriate stuff in their body in different ways and like, contaminated supply, et cetera. So like one way I think about this is like a clean supply issue, but then there's your perspective on this being like predatory and like in a kind of nasty way. And I kind of go, okay, like as a clinician, clinical operator, you have to operate with a mind, like a specific mindset. And that's very different. But I don't know.
I'm going to give you one real concrete example. 6 doses of ketamine, we would ship the first dose, FedEx, adult signature or patient signature required, assuming the patient was fully compliant, and we would track compliance. We would send 2 more doses of ketamine, medium doses, not crazy. Assuming the patient was fully compliant with those 2 additional doses, we would send them 3 doses. So we had 3 FedEx packages going out. Yeah, that's real money. There are companies in the space that will ship initially 18 very high dose amounts of ketamine, 18 doses of ketamine to a patient's house, no signature required, or at least that's what was going on when I was running the company. So I'm a drug liberal. I mean, you heard, I come from the Native American traditions. That's been my spiritual upbringing since I was a child. And, that's a beautiful container. Here, we're in the medicinal container, right? And, recognizing we're in that container, that level of irresponsible prescribing and lack of appropriate controls. And, we at Nue Life were very proud that we had virtually no issues around diversion, people getting our ketamine and using it to party because we were so strict. And, if a patient would used the ketamine outside of the clinical setting, so they didn't log into the app and didn't have us monitor the experience and didn't, verify that they had a sitter with them, and on and on and on. All these things that we did to monitor the experience, we kicked them out of the program.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally, a patient could sort of petition to come back in, and if they had a good excuse and they talked with the clinician, they could be allowed back in. But again, when you're just viewing that your goal is to leverage technology to take the friction out of getting lots of ketamine to the most number of people possible at a very low cost, well, again, the consequences of that are very predictable. And what we have to understand is in 1976, under the Carter administration, there was almost a federal decriminalization of cannabis. And because of some irresponsible actions of one of the, leaders in the drug decriminalization movement at Normal, basically at a, Christmas party of Normal, the CEO of Normal allegedly did cocaine with Hunter S. Thompson, and one of the drug czars of the Carter administration was in the room. It's unclear if he partook or not. And this is, all allegations. But there was such a backlash from that incident that the bill, which was practically on Jimmy Carter's desk and would have, the executive order that would have decriminalized cannabis in 1976 or 1977, didn't end up happening. And a year or two later, my uncle was sentenced to about 10 years in prison for cannabis. And to think of all the communities and lives that have been ruined in the intervening, almost 40 years or 50 years, since that event happened, because cannabis is still, Schedule I drug. And so I'm very concerned because notwithstanding the progress we've made to date, we still have, at the height of the drug war, we had about 2.2 million people's lives being ruined because they were incarcerated for drug crimes. Before COVID, that number stood at 2.1 million. It's come down a bit since then, but not nearly enough. So, from I think it was 1994 or 98, I can't remember. It was under the Clinton administration. That was the height of the drug war because Clinton wanted to show that, he was tough on drugs. He wasn't, that much of a liberal. And there we were in the, 2019, 2018, and that number had come down to 2.1 million. So, if we're not responsible as an industry, if we won't look at ourselves and be honest about what's going on and where the incentives are, we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, which is, some irresponsible actions of a few, people can, create a narrative that makes it very easy for us to lose the progress that we've made. And Joe, think about all the work you've done. And it's only 7, 8 years since you've really seen this curve of progress really begin to accelerate. So it isn't a matter that, the arc of history is on our side. Just the opposite. Look at what went on in the 60s. And there we were in 1977 under the Carter administration. And we were on the verge of getting cannabis decriminalized. Or as my mom would say, grass.
I love this. That was great because often people talk about how easily one action could roll back the movement. And this was like one of the first times I've heard a specific instance of a simple action like that rolling back this movement. I don't know how it's taken till now till I've heard that story. So thank you.
Oh, there's a great podcast. We're going to share it on the show notes. I'm sure I butchered a few of the details. I'd heard that story. And then there's an amazing podcast which goes through precisely that. But yeah, we'll share that in the show notes for sure. It's fascinating. And it really shows, how front page newspaper risk. Look at Matt Perry's death.
Yeah.
He did a bunch of drugs. I don't know the details. I'm just, reading page 6 or whatever. But from what you read, Somebody who's lifelong dealing with depression had a bunch of drugs in his system, made the mistake of getting in a hot tub and drowned. And, what's reported is it was a ketamine death. Not very, you know, doesn't seem like ketamine was, really the proximate cause.
Mm.
But for practitioners, there was a case in New York, it's called Valdez, where a doctor actually was prescribed ketamine, was doing treatments and committed suicide. And there was a malpractice case brought against the doctor who prescribed.
Mm.
And what's very interesting for any clinicians, I would highly recommend you read that case. It's Richard Valdez, and it's a New York case. And even though the doctor was basically acquitted of malpractice, the case makes it very clear that if a couple facts had been slightly different, the doctor who prescribed the ketamine and was dictating the standard of care would have been in all sorts of trouble. And it's hard to imagine that the court and the medical board would not have found the doctor having committed medical malpractice if it had been an at-home model. I mean, if you read that case and the decision in that case, it makes it very, very hard to believe that, at least in New York State, if you had a serious negative outcome, i.e. a suicide death of a patient who, had received 18 doses of ketamine to his or her house, and that patient commits suicide, that the doctor involved would not be deemed to have been negligent and committed medical malpractice. So, the point is, there are these cases around, and this case in New York, it seems like the doctor survived the scrutiny of the court and the medical board by the thinnest of margins. And that's a decision that only recently came out, I think in September, October of last year. So there's a lot of indicia that from a regulatory perspective, we all need to be more careful. I mean, the DEA has put out basically 2 warnings to practitioners, one in 2022 and the other in February 22, and the other in October 2023, basically saying that the DEA is very concerned about compounded ketamine. And again, really, for any providers, I would be very, very careful in terms of the standard of care, because there's increasing scrutiny from medical boards as well as from the DEA itself.
Yeah. I remember reading those DEA warnings, and one of them had a really weak warning. It's not that it was a weak warning. It was a pretty stern warning, but the case, they only included one case in their warning.
I know.
And it seemed like really weak work from the DEA. I don't know. Is that because it was pretty much the guy injected lozenges or something insane like that, which didn't seem right.
Yeah. Look, here's the reality is, and this is what's the risk. I mean, ketamine's very safe and quite effective, at least in the short term. It's the most widely used anesthetic. I'm not a doctor, right? So let's,
I just play one on the internet.
Everyone should take all this.
Yeah.
Right. But, for having been the CEO of Nue Life, where we, supported 100, legal ketamine experiences and tracked the results, what I understand from my clinicians is ketamine's the most widely used anesthesia in the world. And it's one of the few anesthesias that doesn't notice or doesn't affect blood pressure and heart rate for the majority of patients. And so, it's quite safe, and at least, in the short term, very effective at helping, with depression and anxiety. The FDA, on the other hand, says, which is very interesting, the FDA, and this is in what they published October 10th, 2023, the FDA has not determined that ketamine is safe and effective for the treatment of psychiatric disorders. The FDA is not aware of evidence to suggest that ketamine is safer, is more effective, or works faster than medications that are FDA approved for the treatment of certain psychiatric disorders. My view is that's disingenuous. But, that's the DEA talking. And if you're in this space, you should really, take this regulatory scrutiny seriously. Because if you don't, as you just pointed out, a lot of the progress, that has been done or has been achieved to date, we could quickly lose. If we had 3 or 4 more high-profile cases involving ketamine deaths, you know, other than, Matt Perry. So if you had a couple people, being prescribed ketamine who, had suicidal ideation and committed suicide, yeah, that would be really bad. And you know how it is, even though, ketamine's not a traditional psychedelic, it gets grouped in as with psychedelics. And, I can tell you that, the people at MAPS who are, pushing to get MDMA legalized, and people who are trying to get ibogaine and all sorts of other compounds, a path to legal use, could really find, their efforts compromised. So I'm very concerned.
So a couple other things you mentioned in the article, it was your blog, something around the lack of consistency between practitioners, both therapists and prescribers. And I think this speaks to what you were just mentioning a little bit too, is bring in a company with some devil horns on it, J&J, right? Like J&J brings across Spravato, right? Spravato is effectively ketamine filtered.
Yep.
And it's not a different drug by like any standard I've seen. It's not a different drug from ketamine. Like it would be really hard to make that argument. Like it's the isomer conversation, right? And I don't. And they had the cash to push it through the FDA for treatment-resistant depression. It's now insurance reimbursable. Prescribers hate using it for what it's worth. And I've talked to some heads of hospitals.
It's been a huge dud for J&J as an economic model.
But I still feel like there's some ignorance and or willful ignorance and or just misrepresenting what people think when they have this ketamine conversation. Like you were saying, like the DEA, FDA being a little disingenuous that ketamine isn't helpful for psychiatric situations a la Spravato. And is that protectionism? Is that collusion with somebody like J&J? Like we kind of know that J&J has some iffy PR practices here and there.
Yeah, well, look, let me address, I think, which is, at the beginning of your question, you alluded to, which is, clinicians. I mean, the reality, as I keep repeating, ketamine's an amazing tool, but often the person who's prescribed, the practitioner who's prescribing the ketamine isn't a psychiatrist and, doesn't have the background or tools to provide the appropriate integration and aftercare. That's why at Nue Life, we had a medical team at one point that was over 60 clinicians. So we had doctors who were extremely experienced at prescribing. And then we had a whole separate team that was extremely good at providing the integration and aftercare. And for me, that's the kind of model you need. If you have a solo practitioner who just has a thick script pad and a pen with a lot of ink, that's a recipe for disaster. Similarly, clinicians who, are willing to partner with other clinicians and build a team to support the patient, that's really what we need to start, thinking about. And, taking the industry, the bad actors in the industry to task for, sort of jeopardizing the work that's, the good work that's been done. So yeah, from my perspective, you need to create that ecosystem where, and again, what did we do to keep costs reasonable? I mean, we had, licensed therapists on staff, but we also had coaches, right? And just the way, you all at Psychedelics Today, or I don't know if it's a sister company, you offer all these, sort of coach courses to help, psychedelic coaches, et cetera, get the experience and the tools and the training they need in order to be able to offer that service. Well, most of those people going through your course aren't actually licensed therapists, right? But again, their costs or what they're going to charge to provide their services is probably going to be more competitive, notwithstanding the fact they have a fair amount of training and very good training to offer the support in terms of a psychedelic or integrating coach. And so, yeah, we really have to, I think, as an industry, just be much more honest about, what's going on, where are the incentives, and, what needs to be built in order to have that standard of care. But I absolutely believe, the pharmaceutical companies are way too close to the regulators. Absolutely. But what do we expect when, getting a drug approved by the FDA is $1 billion proposition? I mean, look at what MAPS has gone through. And, they're still raising money, notwithstanding the amazing clinical results that they've had with MDMA. Rick Doblin, the founder, was just in Miami a couple weeks ago, raising money. I mean, good money, raising money also to support initiatives in Israel and Gaza and trying to bring those communities together, which is really beautiful, but also continuing to raise money for clinical trials of a drug that wasn't made illegal until 1982. So it's not as if, in terms of the safety profile of MDMA, we don't have oodles and oodles of real life data, prior to 1982. So it's just nothing's a better sign of how broken the system is than what MAPS has gone through.
So I'm going to throw out kind of what I would like to see. I'd love your reaction, and then maybe we can wind down here. So what I would love to see is communities or an enlightened self-interest leading people towards creating an industry association around ketamine to share resources, to bridge the gap on the most essential things, so that we can get some sort of scientific consensus around what is most appropriate, what are best practices, and what are perhaps some tools. To your point earlier, what are some tools that we could potentially share as an industry so we can keep doing well for our people that are sick? And I think the lack of industry association pits us against like J&J in a really bad way. Where like small operators going up against like a J&J is not very easy alone. But if everybody collectivized and perhaps worked collaboratively with the FDA and DEA, perhaps we could come up with something good. But I don't really see any project like that underway as far as I know.
No. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, what we've seen in the psychedelic space and in the ketamine space, unfortunately, is, what happened with indigenous groups, when the Europeans arrived, which the Europeans were masters of dividing and conquering, right? That, they would meet a new tribe, a new peoples. The first thing they would do is they would kill the spiritual leader, the medicine man, and they'd negotiate with the chief. And if the chief didn't play ball, they would install the chief from down the river to, be in charge of these people. And unfortunately, in this space, often, we view each other because of the economic, incentives as the main competition. And, I used to always point out when I was running Nue Life that, in essence, all of these companies were the first generation of for-profit psychedelic companies, and we were all just beautiful experiments. Because I didn't like or believe in the mission behind many of those experiments, I built a company that would lead with its mission. And I, was very we were very successful for a time. And, so going to what you say, yes, there should be an industry association where, we agree on some basic principles that we can all agree on, and, some standards of care. So for instance, real basic things like you shouldn't be sending 18 doses of high doses of ketamine to somebody's house, period, and certainly not without requiring an adult signature as a way to, save yourself a few extra dollars. Like there's some very basic things, or, you shouldn't be offering ketamine therapy if you're not offering some sort of integration and aftercare. Just real basic things. And then the more that, that industry association could really, offer, standards for practitioners, and best practices, et cetera, you could bring more and more practitioners into the fray, and then you could be a much more effective lobbying group. Because you're right. I mean, what big pharma is extremely good at, I think, even with MAPS, unfortunately, is, keeping these therapies very, very much at the fringe. And, the numbers of people doing ketamine therapy today, at least, some of the studies I've seen, has actually gone down over the last couple of years. Why? Because so many ketamine clinics popped up. The economics of those ketamine clinics, because customer acquisition is hard, made a lot of those clinics not nearly as profitable. And so a little bit like we've seen in cannabis, we've seen, a lot of, sort of pullback. And so that's meant that there's fewer alternatives to the consumers that you were mentioning before, the rural consumers, the consumers, who are middle to lower income, school teachers, first responders, veterans, and the kinds of consumers, that I think we can all agree should be, have an alternative to antidepressants, or anti-anxiety meds, or just an alternative to not feeling good. That's what we all, that's what we should all be thinking about as an industry.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, what can we say? Like, people are going to be curious. I saw some people floating around asking questions online. What can you say about your exit at Nue Life, or how that went down?
Oh, sure. I can say two things. That I started my article saying that, I can no longer endorse at-home ketamine therapy for patients. I can't recommend that, for family and friends. And I'm sad about that, but I'm not aware of any provider who's, from my perspective, doing it right. And I'm not singling out any one company, but I can tell you that, including, my former company, I think, my perspective is it's lost its way. I'm no longer involved, with the company that took over Nue Life's operations. I do wish that they would, rebrand, because I think the ethos is very different today, but, that's their decision. And, but I can no longer endorse, any at-home ketamine providers. There are, inpatient providers and some amazing clinicians. And I think, quite honestly, those clinicians are relieved that somebody's speaking up, because they're feeling a lot of pressure, from less ethical clinicians. And you know, we started Nue Life to be of service, and if I can continue to be of service, having conversations like this and trying to elevate the standard of care, and shining a light at the industry and its business practices, and I'm super happy to do that.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for taking a stand and sharing the opinion here. This is good stuff. And yeah, like the promise that we're all so excited about for psychedelics is a limited time window of treatment. Like, let's give you less than 10 total lifetime treatments, hopefully one, and then we're good. Yeah.
Yeah. And then look, I mean, I sit around the fire, in our church, very different, somewhere between 2 and 6 times a year. And I don't feel like I need to. I mean, I think, we should also be honest that, there's a place for, these kind of, experiences beyond just, sort of the clinical, to address very specific things. But again, in the medicinal model, which is where we are, we need to keep things medicinal, and not, just about, personal growth and personal development. And, again, I don't see a place for maintenance ketamine. I don't see a place where one of the key performance indicators of a ketamine provider is, what percentage of patients are reoccurring patients. I mean, I think once that number gets too high into the double digits, 10, 20, 30%, whatever, that number's too high. I think, as an industry, that number needs to, remain low.
Makes me want regulators to take a different kind of approach and actually say, hey, is this actually medicine or is this just a money mill? I think that's important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but again, I as you know, the regulators, as you pointed out, have, a vested interest in allowing big pharma and, real established players to continue to dominate things. And so, I would much rather have the solution come from the inside. And, again, that's where I really actually, very much appreciate the work, you guys are doing, Psychedelics Today, training practitioners, coaches, integration experts. I mean, that's super needed, creating a forum where people like me can express our, bit contrarian views. That's super needed. And so, I think it takes a village, and, we just have to elevate the conversation and, keep holding people accountable in the industry.
Yeah. Amen. Well, Juan Pablo, thank you so much for being here. I hope we can do it again. Let's debrief for a minute. And then, I can't wait to have you on again.
Love it. I appreciate you.
And there you have it, Juan Pablo Cappello. I hope you enjoyed this one. And I think there's a lot of important insight we can pull from that, given we're a few years into this larger ketamine conversation now. I think we can speak more to it than we could before. There's amazing ways that we're providing good medical access, and there's also not so amazing ways we are. So in this conversation, we're very specifically talking about the medical category. So what should, perhaps how should clinic operators be running their stuff? Yeah. Anyway, I think that's it for now. Please share this with your friends. If you loved it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Spotify does ratings as well. All right. I think that's it. We will see you later. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. This is Joe Moore signing off. Bye-bye.